Welcome to Sustainable Intelligence, where we discuss all things ESG and sustainability for the private markets, brought to you by Novata. I'm Ella Williamson, and I'm thrilled to be your host. Joining us today is Allison Green, ESG Metrics and Regulations Associate here at Novata. She supports private market participants in understanding, reporting, and collecting ESG metrics to either comply with regulations or deliver on their sustainability goals. Allison has a background in environmental economics and is an expert on biodiversity, ocean impact, waste management, human rights, and even responsible AI. So today, we're going to get Allison's expert insights from COP16 and biodiversity. So Allison, could you start by explaining the primary goals of COP16 for biodiversity? And how do you envision these translating into tangible actions and policies on a global scale?
Yes, thanks for having me. So let's break down what was happening at COP16 earlier in the month. This was a big moment for global biodiversity efforts where leaders had really intended to finally move past talking points and push for real action on the ground. If you remember back at COP15 in 2022, where they set some pretty ambitious goals, this was where the global biodiversity framework was set and targets like conserving 30% of the planet's land and waters and restoring degraded ecosystems were set. COP16 was all about seeing how far everyone's come on that front and turning those targets into measurable actions. A big piece of the puzzle was funding. There's been a massive financial gap here in biodiversity efforts. And so Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework urged the mobilization of around $200 billion per year from all sources by 2030 to protect nature. So all sources meaning domestic, international, public, and most importantly, private sector funding. A key component of that is to increase international financial support to the least developed countries and small island developing states. So this materialized in the Global Biodiversity Framework by requiring developed countries to contribute at least $20 billion per year by 2025, so that's just next year, and then at least $30 billion by 2030 to these countries with less resources. The financial support here is really critical since a lot of the world's richest biodiversity areas, like tropical rainforests, are located in lower income countries with less resources. So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. The aim is to ensure that these funds help make nature conservation both politically and economically sustainable. And a major test at COP16 was to see whether wealthier developed countries had stepped up their financial pledges to meet their promise of providing $20 billion per year for developing countries by next year. In addition to the funding, we also had a few other areas of focus for COP16, spotlighting the agriculture and water sectors, which are major drivers of biodiversity loss. So think, policies and initiatives that could improve farming efficiency, that could cut down on habitat destruction and promote sustainable water use. And then the other huge focus was bringing Indigenous communities into these plans. Their knowledge and land rights are vital pieces to the puzzle of biodiversity preservation and sustainable ecosystem management. Now, if we're being honest, looking back on what was actually achieved during that 2-week period, what I just mentioned was a lot. And so, yes, there were accomplishments from COP16, but the question on funding was left unanswered. And the goal of creating a universal monitoring framework to hold members accountable was also not met. So there was a lot of lead up and there were a lot of goals. And I'm not sure whether those goals were met.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that insight, Allison. So it sounds like even though those high-level goals have been set, it's the actual actionable solutions and insights that we're yet to see coming from COP16. So why is biodiversity critical in addressing global changes such as climate change, food security, and public health? And how do preservation efforts contribute to ecosystem resilience and human well-being? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yes. Biodiversity at the root of it is like the safety net holding up our planet's life support systems. It's extremely critical. When it comes to tackling huge issues like climate change, food security, and public health, preserving biodiversity is not just about saving species. It's about keeping these systems stable and resilient. Think of biodiverse ecosystems like forests, wetlands, coral reefs as some of our best natural defenses against climate change. For instance, a diverse forest ecosystem is packed with a mix of plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms, all interacting together to support the ecosystem's health and resilience. These forests offer a wide range of services. They filter water, they regulate temperature, they store carbon and stabilize soil. When forests are diverse, they're more resilient to climate disruptions like wildfires, and they can keep storing carbon effectively, helping to buffer climate impacts over time. Unlike monoculture forests, which is just one plant species or one type of tree in an entire forest, that could be easily devastated by a single event and completely wiped out. So biodiversity supports other things as well. Public health, like we said, in some surprising ways. Many of our medicines, like aspirin, morphine, penicillin, all of those are coming from compounds found in nature, often from plants or organisms in biodiverse environments. And diverse ecosystems can help regulate disease by keeping populations of disease-carrying species in check. For example, forests with a variety of species often have fewer mosquitoes that carry diseases because natural predators keep their numbers balanced. When biodiversity declines, we lose these natural checks, which can increase the spread of diseases. And when we talk about preservation efforts, that might be protecting habitats, restoring degraded areas. These actions directly boost ecosystem resilience. A resilient ecosystem can bounce back much faster from challenges like droughts or floods, and is better equipped to handle climate stressors. For us, this resilience translates to more reliable natural services, like cleaner air and water, stable food supplies, and even reduced risks from diseases, like I had mentioned. So protecting biodiversity is really all about creating a strong, adaptable foundation that benefits both nature and people, giving us the stability that we need to tackle today's global challenges head on.
I love the way you describe the need to put a safety net around biodiversity. And ultimately, that is an investment in our future today, but it will build a more sustainable world for generations to come. So if we can just go back to COP15 now, what have you seen to be the major successes and challenges in biodiversity conservation? And can you share a few examples of effective strategies or standout projects that are really making a difference today?
Absolutely. Since COP15, there have been some solid wins in biodiversity conservation, but also a devastating amount of tough challenges. Take the EU's Deforestation Regulation, for example. This was thought to be a landmark regulation. The regulation established rules to ensure that products derived from certain commodities like coffee, cocoa, palm oil, cattle, wood, and which are placed on the EU market or exported from the EU have not caused deforestation or forest degradation during their production. This regulation was meant to really dig into responsible supply chain practices. But last month, the application of the regulation, which was originally set for December 30th of 2024, which is just next month, was delayed for 12 months by the European Council. The delay came from a response to mounting pressure from companies and governments who expressed real concern about, one, the economic impact. Full implementation of the EUDR will likely have adverse effects at first on producers, downstream commercial customers and consumers, and may lead to market instability, including higher prices and trade disruptions. And second, general frustrations over the need for additional information, clarity, guidance. How do these companies implement the regulation to ensure a smooth transition? The EUDR was agreed upon right around COP15 in December of 2022, and only recently has the European Commission published additional EUDR guidance. So they had about a year and a half where companies had very little guidance, Only recently are they getting a better understanding on how to cover legality requirements, what the time frame of application looks like, how agricultural use is involved, what clarifications were needed on different product scope. The guidance also addresses traceability obligations, penalties. It provides clarifications on definitions and expands answers to its FAQ section. So the first year and a half, companies were supposed to be preparing. The guidance they had on how to do so and what they're preparing for was pretty limited. So you can understand why there was so much concern and pushback here. Although the delay offers more time for implementation, the delay will inevitably hinder immediate progress toward climate goals. So you have to hope that with an extra year for preparation, when the time comes, which will be next year now, December 2025, companies will be ready to ensure that their supply chains are deforestation free. Now, that may sound a little more bitter than sweet, but that's not to say that there's been zero progress on biodiversity conservation initiatives since COP15. There are leaders in the space that indicate positive shifts as well. Keeping in line with the theme of deforestation, let's take the example of the Brazilian state of Para, which launched the Para Cattle Integrity and Development Program, the nation's first mandatory cattle traceability initiative, which covers over 24 million cattle across more than 295,000 farms. This program aims to enhance supply chain transparency and reduce deforestation linked to cattle ranching. This is critical, especially knowing that cattle ranching in Brazil has historically accounted for nearly 24% of global annual tropical deforestation. So that's one leader. More recently, too, and right before COP16, we saw a big uptick in the establishment of marine protected areas, indicating progress towards the global goal of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. That's great. I will note, though, that currently less than 2% of the high seas are protected. So it's a really great sign that we've seen an increase in the establishment of marine protected areas, but there's still a lot to do to close the gap from 2% to 30% by 2030.
So it sounds like there have been some great successes over that period, but also there have been some delays, which is ultimately slowing our progress towards those goals. Now, in terms of if we're thinking about COP16 and the plans to integrate Indigenous knowledge and communities in biodiversity presentation, what unique insights do they bring to conservation efforts that we didn't before?
Indigenous communities are on the front line of the battle to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. They have essential knowledge and insight into both the effects and potential solutions, and they must be supported with the resources and the funding to take action. Less than 0.1% of funding to mitigate climate change finds its way to Indigenous organizations, despite their disproportionate exposure to the effects. And so at COP16, this was a historic moment. Delegates reached a historic agreement to establish a subsidiary body that includes Indigenous peoples in future decisions on nature conservation. This body will be co-chaired by representatives from both UN parties and Indigenous communities, ensuring that traditional knowledge systems are recognized and integrated into global and national biodiversity management. Indigenous communities offer unique insights into conservation through their deep-rooted connection to the land and the sustainable practices that have been developed over generations. Their traditional ecological knowledge encompasses understandings of local species, ecosystems, and resource management techniques that have maintained biodiversity long before modern conservation methods existed. By involving Indigenous voices, conservation efforts can benefit from these time-tested practices, leading to more effective and culturally respectful strategies for preserving biodiversity.
Wow, so 0.1% of funding is a pretty stark statistic. This really highlights the importance of getting that balance right to ensure environmental and cultural sustainability in the future. Now, given the ongoing funding challenges, what new mechanisms or innovations are being introduced at COP16 to support biodiversity initiatives, particularly involving the private sector and global collaborations?
Yeah, so like you said, there have been ongoing funding challenges, within biodiversity conservation efforts. And unfortunately, policymakers still failed to secure significant financial commitment for nature conservation at COP16. Amid these challenges, though, several innovative mechanisms were introduced to engage the private sector and really foster global collaboration. There was a newly launched Cali Fund, which aims to generate about $1 billion annually for conservation efforts through a revenue sharing model that focuses on genetic resources. And that model really encourages companies to share the revenues from genetic resources with developing countries. So if you need an example, think big pharmaceutical companies. These huge pharmaceutical companies that make billions in revenue profit off of the natural resources that biodiverse ecosystems such as rainforests provide. And they're getting that revenue, but the underdeveloped countries are not, and they're not able to reinvest that revenue into conservation efforts. So there's now more of a profit sharing model that's taking place between companies and developing countries. So this approach really encourages companies to contribute financially by channeling the profits from genetic resources into conservation funding. COP16 did see an increase in private sector presence with over 3,000 companies and investors in attendance. That tripling the turnout that took place at COP15 in Montreal. However, only about 5% of businesses currently assess their environmental impact. So there is a substantial gap in corporate accountability. So as I mentioned, channeling financial profits, that's kind of the positive side of private engagement, but there's still that lack of corporate accountability. And so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures was a big piece of COP16 in terms of publicizing their framework. And that framework is really useful for engaging and enhancing corporate accountability. The TNFD is emerging as a key mechanism to address funding challenges for biodiversity initiatives by creating a standardized framework that allows businesses and financial institutions to measure, report, and manage their nature-related risks. While TNFD itself doesn't directly generate funding for biodiversity, it does provide a framework that enables the private sector to really understand, assess, and disclose biodiversity-related risks and opportunities in a standardized way. So this clarity can unlock new funding mechanisms and attract private investment. It can also act as a framework preparing organizations for nature-related regulations that are likely to come. At COP16, TNFD gained considerable traction as companies and investors recognized that understanding biodiversity impacts can drive better financial and environmental outcomes.
Thanks, Allison. So it sounds like although there were many more people at COP16, it's actually all about that collaboration between governments, industries and communities to ensure long-term sustainable outcomes for the funding. Now, to finish on, I'd love you to look ahead. What does the future of biodiversity conservation look like, and how can companies contribute their part?
Yeah, the future of biodiversity conservation is highly dependent on the resources that countries put toward nature-related initiatives and the monitoring mechanisms that are put in place to keep members accountable for their contributions. But as we saw, COP16 did not really deliver such promising solutions on either of those subjects. So looking forward, another big piece is the responsibility that companies need to take to assess their environmental impact. As I was talking about before, corporate accountability is huge, and this is really important for the future. And a big piece of corporate accountability is not just an organization's current operations, but also their supply chain impact. The TNFD framework is a big piece of assessing your operations and assessing your supply chain impact, as is the recent GRI biodiversity disclosure that was released earlier this year. Both of these frameworks provide organizations a strong way to identify and assess the nature-related issues that are most material to their business and really help to begin measuring and managing the nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities for long-term resilience. So both frameworks can help close that corporate accountability gap. An important piece of these frameworks are the supply chain management. I personally don't see a future of conservation where supply chain management is not taken into serious consideration. And the importance of supply chain has really been highlighted both in the Global Biodiversity Framework that was established at COP15 and is continuing to see traction. Supply chains often operate in biodiversity hotspots, and without proper oversight, they can contribute to deforestation, habitat loss, and pollution, all key drivers of biodiversity decline. And you can see the increase in supply chain management by just looking back to the EU regulation on deforestation. So not only are we seeing private companies need to report on their supply chain practices, but we're actually seeing it take place in regulation. So capturing supply chain data, it really allows businesses to identify environmental risks, adopt sustainable sourcing practices, and align with global goals like the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's also about staying competitive. I mean, customers, investors, and regulators, as I said, are demanding transparency and accountability. Plus, supply chain resilience depends on healthy ecosystems. And these healthy ecosystems provide critical services like pollination, water purification, carbon sinks. By leveraging this information, companies can not only protect biodiversity, they can also mitigate their financial risks, they can support innovation, and really invest in solutions like regenerative agriculture or reforestation. So ultimately, businesses that prioritize corporate accountability and supply chain transparency are better positioned to lead in the sustainability space.
Thank you so much for all of that detail, Allison. And it's great to hear that Novata is hosting the GRI Biodiversity Standard on its platform. I'm sure this will empower many companies to navigate these frameworks and prepare for TNFD disclosures in the future. Thank you for all of the fascinating comments and insights. It's really clear that the integration of technology, regulations, private sector involvement will be essential in driving impactful biodiversity conservation as we move towards COP17. Until next time, let's keep building sustainable intelligence together. Find out more at novata.com.